The thermal scanner on the salvage rig had been broken for 3 years, so when it pinged that afternoon, Riggs assumed it was lying again. He tapped it twice with the side of his wrench, the way he always did, and waited for the false reading to clear. It did not clear. The little orange dot kept blinking on the cracked screen, steady and slow, deep inside a stretch of debris that everyone with a working brain stayed away from. Riggs sighed and pushed his cap back. He was a thin man with rough hands and a face that had forgotten how to look surprised. He had been pulling old wrecks out of the Vela drift for 19 years, and he had a rule about thermal pings in that part of space. The rule was simple: ignore them. The radiation pockets in the drift played tricks on old sensors, and the few real signals that did come through usually belonged to bodies. Riggs had pulled enough bodies in his life. He did not need more. But the dot kept blinking, and the freighter was already drifting close to the source on lazy autopilot, and Riggs found himself thinking about how the protein bar he had eaten for lunch had been the last one in the locker. He was already going home empty. One look would cost him nothing. He guided the Marabelle in slow. The wreck field was a mess of broken transport hulls, most of them stripped clean a century ago, all of them turning gently in the dark like dead fish in still water. The thermal signal came from a dented metal box wedged between two of the larger hulls. It was an alien design, square and ribbed, with markings Riggs did not recognize. He hooked it with a magnetic line and reeled it into his cargo bay. The box was warm to the touch. That alone was strange in space. Riggs cycled the bay, let the air come back, and pulled on his old gloves before he opened the lid. He half expected a dead animal. He half expected nothing at all. What he got was 4 small faces looking up at him with bright black eyes. They were scaled smoke gray on top and copper bright on the belly, with wings folded tight against their tiny backs. The biggest one was no longer than his forearm. They were thin, shaking, and clearly half-starved. One of them coughed, and a small puff of blue flame came out of its mouth and faded in the air before it reached the lid. Riggs sat down hard on the cargo floor. He had grown up on a farming colony where his grandmother told him stories about creatures like this. But those were old stories, the kind people told children to make them eat their vegetables. Dragons were not real. Dragons had never been real. And yet here were 4 of them, breathing weakly in a busted metal box, watching him with the careful patience of things that had decided to trust one more time before they died. The smallest one had a torn ear. It tried to lift its head and could not. Riggs forgot every rule he had ever made about salvage runs. He pulled off his outer jacket and laid it across them. He went to the cockpit, dug out his canteen, and brought back the last of his clean water. He poured a few drops into his palm and held it out. The biggest one drank first, careful, polite somehow. Then the others drank. The smallest one, the one with the torn ear, was too weak to lift its head, so Riggs slid one finger under its jaw and held the water to its mouth. It drank for a long time. When it was done, it closed its eyes and pressed its tiny scaled face into his hand and stayed there. Riggs did not know what to do, so he did the only thing he could think of. He sat on the cold cargo floor with 4 impossible animals curled into his jacket, and he stayed there until they all fell asleep. The autopilot beeped at him eventually. Course confirmation, it asked. Riggs looked down at the 4 small shapes breathing slowly against his ribs. He could turn them over to the colony authority on the next inhabited station. That was the legal thing. He could leave them in the box and toss them back into the drift. That was the safe thing. He could call the long-range comm and announce his find to anyone who paid for rare specimens. That was the rich thing. He did none of those things. He set a course for Pelin Hollow, his own dusty home moon, the place he had been heading anyway, and he told himself it was just for tonight, just until they got their strength back, just until he figured out who they belonged to. He was not the kind of man who kept things. He was the kind of man who delivered things and moved on. The smallest one shifted in its sleep and pressed its torn ear against the side of his neck. Riggs froze. He could feel its tiny heartbeat through his collar, fast and light, like a moth trapped in a jar. He sat there for a long time without moving. Outside, the Vela drift turned slowly past the cockpit window, full of old wrecks and older silences, and Riggs did not know that he had just picked up the last 4 living children of a species the galaxy had given up on 400 years before. He only knew that something small was trusting him completely, and that he had not earned it yet. He swore quietly into the dark of the cargo bay, and he promised them nothing, because he was not a man who made promises. But he set the engines for home. Rain on Pelin Hollow always came sideways. It was the kind of rain that found the holes in your roof no matter how many times you patched them, and Riggs's garage habitat had a lot of holes. He landed the Marabelle in his usual berth behind the repair dock at the worst hour of the night, when the bar was closed and the neighbors were drunk or asleep, and he carried his cargo home inside an old fuel crate with the lid loose for air. The 4 hatchlings did not make a sound the whole way. They had learned something already in their short lives in the dark box about staying quiet when humans walked. His garage was a single long room with a workbench along one wall, a cot in the corner, and a busted reactor coil he used as a foot warmer in winter. Riggs lit the coil, dragged it to the middle of the floor, and built a nest around it from welding blankets and an old coat that had not fit him in 10 years. He set the crate down beside it and tipped it gently sideways. The 4 small dragons did not come out. Riggs waited. He poured himself a drink he did not really want and sat on the floor against the workbench, his back to the wall, and he waited some more. After a while, the biggest one crept out, sniffed the warm coil, and pressed itself flat against the heat with a long, shaky breath that sounded almost human. The others followed in a tumble, climbing over each other to reach the warmth. The smallest one with the torn ear stayed in the crate. Riggs reached in slowly and lifted it out. It weighed nothing. He set it down on the warmest part of the coil and it stayed where he put it, eyes half closed. He tried to feed them in the morning. He opened a can of fish protein, the cheap kind, and set it in front of them. They sniffed it and turned away. He tried a piece of dried meat. They sniffed it and turned away. He tried bread. He tried sugar water. He tried everything in his cupboard and they would not eat any of it. By the second day, the smallest one had stopped lifting its head when he came near. Riggs sat on the floor and rubbed his face with both hands. He was not a man who knew how to keep things alive. His plants died. His last cat had run away. He had no business with these creatures, and they were going to die in his garage because he did not know what they ate. He thought about it for a long time. Then he tore open a protein bar, the kind he ate on long runs, and he chewed a piece himself before he spat it into his palm and held it out. He did not know why he did it. It was something his grandmother had done with orphan lambs, long ago, on a planet he barely remembered. The biggest hatchling crept forward, sniffed his palm, and ate. The others followed. They ate from his hand for an hour, slowly, gaining strength with every bite. The smallest one with the torn ear refused to come down off the coil, so Riggs carried the food to it and held it under its chin. It ate. When it was done, it climbed into the crook of his elbow and went asleep there. It did not leave his shoulder again for 3 days. He gave them names on the 4th morning. He did not mean to. He was working under the freighter, lying on a creeper with grease on his hands, and the biggest one came waddling out to sit on his chest. He looked down at the soot smudge on its nose and said, without thinking, "Soot, get off me." The hatchling tilted its head. The name stuck. The other 2 got names by the end of the week. The bright copper one with the loud voice he called Penny. The quiet one who liked to sleep inside his tool drawer he called Bram. The smallest one with the torn ear did not seem to need a real name. He just called it Little. And Little answered to it the way some animals answer to anything said with affection. Hetty came on the 8th day. She was the old woman from the greenhouse next door, the one who grew tomatoes and minded everyone's business and missed nothing. She knocked twice and walked in without waiting, because that was how Hetty knocked, and she stopped 2 steps inside the door with her mouth slightly open. Penny was on the workbench eating a piece of dried fruit. Soot was asleep on the cot. Bram was inside the tool drawer with only his tail showing. Little was on Riggs's shoulder, and Little was watching her. Hetty sat down on a stool very slowly. She did not scream. She did not run. She looked at the 4 hatchlings, and then she looked at Riggs, and then she looked back at the hatchlings, and then she said, in a voice that was very careful and very quiet, "My grandmother used to tell me a story about creatures like this." Riggs put down his wrench. She told him the story. She told him about the old star charts that listed a species called the Vorin, and how their cradle worlds had gone silent 4 centuries ago, and how no one had seen one alive since. She told him the stories said they had wings of smoke and bellies of copper, and that they had loved humans once, long before anyone alive could remember. Riggs looked at Little on his shoulder. Little looked back at him with quiet black eyes, and Riggs understood, finally, that the trouble had not even started yet. A trader called Bex came home drunk from the bar on a Thursday and told his wife he had seen something fly across Riggs's roof and catch a piece of bread in its mouth. His wife told her sister. Her sister told a man who was buying fuel rods, and the man who was buying fuel rods did not live on Pelin Hollow. He sold information for money. 2 weeks after Hetty had sat on the stool in Riggs's garage, 2 strangers stepped off the morning shuttle. They wore long gray coats. They were tall and pale, and their faces did not move the way human faces moved. They walked through the dust of the colony with the slow patience of people who already knew where they were going. They asked the dockmaster polite questions about local livestock and unusual pets. They smiled too much, and they did not blink enough, and the dockmaster did not like them but could not say why. Hetty heard about them within an hour. She always heard about everything within an hour. She crossed the muddy yard between the greenhouse and Riggs's garage with her shawl pulled tight, and she came in without knocking and said one sentence: "They are here." Riggs was on the floor with Soot in his lap. He did not ask who. He stood up and started moving. The freighter had an empty water tank in the belly of the hull. He had not used it since the seals had gone bad 2 years ago, and it was dark and dry and just big enough for 4 small bodies. He lined it with welding blankets and lifted the hatchlings in one at a time. Soot went first, calm somehow. Penny went second, complaining in small chirps. Bram had to be coaxed out of the tool drawer. Little he carried in himself, because Little would not be put anywhere by anyone else. He sealed the hatch and went back to the garage, and started cleaning up every sign that anything unusual had ever lived there. The gray coats came that afternoon. They were perfectly polite. They introduced themselves with names that sounded fake even to Riggs's ear. They said they were buyers of rare animals, and they had heard a rumor, and they wondered if Riggs would be kind enough to let them have a look around his garage. They smiled when they said it. They smiled in a way that did not reach their eyes. Riggs let them in. He did not have a choice. He played the part of a tired salvage man with nothing to hide. He offered them tea he did not have. He let them look in the tool drawer, which was empty, and on the cot, which was clean, and behind the workbench, where there was only dust. He kept his hands in his pockets because his hands were shaking, and he did not want them to see. One of the gray coats stopped near the coil heater. He bent down slowly and ran a long, thin finger along the welding blanket. He lifted his finger to his face and looked at it. There was a single copper scale stuck to it, the size of a grain of rice. He did not say anything. He smiled instead. He let the scale fall back onto the blanket and stood up, and he and his partner thanked Riggs for his time, and they left a small white card on the workbench with no name printed on it. Just a calm code. Just in case, they said. Just in case he remembered seeing anything unusual. They left. Riggs locked the door behind them and stood with his forehead pressed against the wood for a long time. Then he went out to the freighter and opened the water tank. Little came out first. Little crawled up his arm and pressed against his neck and would not let go. That night Riggs did not sleep. He sat on the cot with all 4 hatchlings draped across him in various positions, and he stared at the ceiling and thought. Hetty sat in the chair across from him with a cup of something hot in her hands, and she did not speak for a long time either. Around 2 in the morning she said, "You cannot keep them here." Riggs said, "I know." She said, "They will come back with more." Riggs said, "I know." She said, "Where will you go?" Riggs had been thinking about that for hours. There were old stories in his line of work. Every salvage man heard them eventually. Stories about a listening station deep in the Dust Belt, an ancient place built by a species nobody could name anymore, where the original star charts of the inner galaxy were said to be stored. Most salvage men thought it was a myth. Riggs had met 2 men in his life who claimed they had seen it from a distance and lived. One of them had died drunk and the other had died less drunk, and neither of them had ever gone back. If anything alive still remembered the Voron, Riggs thought, it would be whoever ran a station like that. He told Hetty his plan in a low voice. He expected her to argue. He expected her to tell him he was a fool, which he was, and that he would die out there, which he probably would. Instead, she stood up and went home to pack a bag. Riggs stared after her. Soot lifted his head from his knee and chirped softly. By dawn the Mara Bell was fueled. The hatchlings were on board, and an old woman with a shawl and a stubborn jaw was sitting in the co-pilot seat with her arms folded. Pelin Hollow shrank to a brown dot behind them. Somewhere on the colony, the gray coats were already coming back. For the first 3 days of the crossing, Hetty tried to teach Penny how to sit on command. This turned out to be much harder than she expected, because Penny was bright copper and loud, and had decided early on that Hetty was the funniest creature she had ever met. Penny would tilt her head when Hetty said sit, and she would chirp twice, and then she would climb onto Hetty's lap and bite the end of her shawl. Hetty laughed so hard the second time it happened that Riggs heard it from the cockpit and smiled without meaning to. He had not smiled in a long time. The Dust Belt was a slow crossing. The Mara Bell was not a fast ship, and the route Riggs had picked avoided every shipping lane and every patrol corridor. They moved through empty space on a quiet course, eating from the same supplies, breathing the same recycled air, and watching 4 small dragons grow. They grew fast. By the end of the first week, Soot was the size of a large dog. His scales had darkened, and his wings had begun to spread when he stretched, and a single flap of them could knock a tin cup off the workbench. By the end of the second week, Penny was nearly as big, and Bram had finally come out of the tool drawer permanently because he no longer fit in it. Their flames were no longer little kitten coughs. Soot sneezed once and burned a black mark into the cabin wall, and Riggs had to rewire the air filter system to handle the heat. Little stayed smaller than the others. Little had been weaker from the start, the run of the 4, and the torn ear had never fully healed. But Little was the sharpest of them. Little understood things before the others did. When Riggs spoke to the hatchlings, Soot listened with affection, Penny listened with mischief, Bram barely listened at all, and Little listened the way a person listened. Hetty noticed it first. She said one evening, "That one is thinking." Riggs looked at Little, curled on his shoulder as always, and Little looked back with quiet black eyes, and Riggs did not argue. They were halfway through the Dust Belt on the 15th day when the long-range comm picked up a signal. It was not on any frequency Riggs used. It was old, a band that civilian ships had not broadcast on in 300 years, and the signal was a single low hum, layered. Like wind blowing through a hollow bone. It came in pulses, the same pattern over and over, faint but steady. Riggs would have ignored it. He almost did. Soot froze. Soot was lying across the floor of the cockpit with his wings half open, and when the hum came through the speaker, he lifted his head so fast that his horns clipped the bottom of the navigation console. Then Soot opened his mouth and made a sound Riggs had never heard him make before. It was the same hum. Lower, smaller, but the same shape. Hetty put down her cup. Penny and Bram came running from the back. They both made the sound, too. Little on Riggs's shoulder made it softest of all, almost a whisper, and Little's eyes were wet. Riggs turned the ship. The signal came from a derelict, a single massive shape drifting in the dust belt, dark on every wavelength except that one. It was old. It was huge. As they got closer, Riggs could see that the dust had been collecting on its hull for so long that it looked more like an asteroid than a ship. It was the size of a city. Its running lights were dim. Most of them were dead. The few that still glowed pulsed with the same slow rhythm as the hum. Riggs hailed it on the old frequency. He did not know how to speak it, so he did the only thing he could think of. He held Little up to the comm and he let Little answer. Little hummed into the microphone. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the speaker crackled and a voice came through. It was not really a voice. It was layered, deep, the sound of a very large lung pulling a very long breath. It spoke in a language Riggs did not know, and then it stopped, and then it spoke again in common speech. The common speech was brittle and slow, the way a person spoke who had not used their mouth in 100 years. It said, "Are those young?" Riggs cleared his throat. He said yes. The voice was quiet for a long time. Then it said, "I do not believe my own sensors. I have been alone in the dark for 400 years. I have stopped trusting them. Bring them closer. Let me see them with my own eyes before I die." Riggs looked at Hetty. Hetty looked at Riggs. Riggs eased the Marabelle forward, slow, through the dust, toward the massive sleeping shape. The huge hull grew until it filled the windows. A docking bay opened in its side with the groan of metal that had not moved in centuries. Lights came on one by one along the inside, dim and yellow, like old stars waking up. Riggs docked his small freighter to a ship the size of a city, and the 4 hatchlings pressed against the cockpit glass with their wings half spread, and the hum on the comm grew louder. And somewhere inside that enormous quiet hull, something very old and very tired was lifting its head for the first time in 400 years. Hetty reached over and took Riggs's hand. She did not say anything. Neither did he. The airlock pressurized behind them with a slow, soft hiss, and the inner door began to open, and the hatchlings went very still. Cold air moved past them as the inner door opened, carrying a smell that Riggs could not quite name. It was old, like dry paper and warm stone, and underneath it there was something sweet that reminded him of the spice his grandmother used to put on bread. The corridor on the other side stretched away into shadow. Its ceiling was so high that Riggs could not see it. The walls were carved with shapes he did not understand, long curving lines that looked like wings, and there were dim yellow lights set into the floor at long spaces apart. The lights pulsed slowly, the way a heart pulsed, keeping time with something deeper that Riggs could feel in his chest more than hear. Soot walked out of the airlock first. He did not look back to ask permission. He padded down the corridor on his 4 young legs with his wings half open, and his head was high, and his tail was steady. Penny followed, then Bram, then Riggs and Hetty, and Little came last, riding on Riggs's shoulder with both small claws hooked carefully into his collar. They walked for a long time. The corridor opened, eventually, into a great round room with a domed ceiling, and the ceiling had once shown stars, but the lights were mostly dead now, and only a scatter of them still glowed. In the center of the room, lying on a wide, low platform, was the keeper. It was enormous. It was twice the height of a man standing up, but it was not standing. It lay curled around itself with its long tail wrapped around its own feet, and its great wings were folded tight against its back, and its scales were the color of old iron with veins of green where age had crept in. Its eyes were pale, almost white, and Riggs understood after a moment that the keeper was nearly blind. The keeper lifted its head very slowly. It looked at the four young dragons, and then it looked at Riggs, and then it did something that Riggs would remember every night for the rest of his life. It lowered its great head all the way down to the metal floor. It pressed its forehead against the deck, and it wept. The sound it made was not loud. It was a soft, broken hum, the same sound Soot had answered on the comm, but smaller now and full of something that Riggs had no words for. Hetty stepped back without meaning to, and her hand came up to her mouth, and she did not lower it again for a long time. Soot walked across the floor and pressed his nose against the keeper's huge face. The keeper opened one pale eye, and the great long neck curved, and the keeper breathed on Soot once, a slow, warm breath, and Soot closed his eyes and stood very still. After a while the keeper spoke again. It told them the story. It told them in slow, brittle common speech, with long pauses between the words, as though it was trying to remember how to shape them. It said its people had been called the Vorin. It said they had been many once, scattered across a dozen cradle worlds, with cities of warm stone and skis full of wings. It said the end had not come from war. It said the end had come from a plague carried in the radiation pockets of the Vela Drift, a sickness that took the adults first, and quickly, and left only the young in cradle ships sent out to drift in the dust until rescue came. Rescue had never come. The keeper said it had been alone on this ship for 400 years. It had been sending the hum on the old frequency the whole time. It had watched its own kind go cold one ship at a time across the belt. It had stopped counting the funerals. It had stopped expecting an answer. The container Riggs had found in the drift was the last cradle still drifting with living children inside. The keeper raised its great head and looked at Riggs with its pale, milky eyes, and it called him a word in its own language. Then it translated. Kin by act, it said. The word had not been spoken aloud in 4 centuries, and the keeper said it like it tasted of something sweet. Then the keeper said the second thing. It said, the ones in gray coats are not buyers. Riggs went very still. The keeper said they are scavengers. They are a younger species. They have been hunting cradle ships for centuries, taking the scales and the bones and the metal. They have grown rich on our quiet. They tracked your ship from the colony moon. They are coming here now. Hetty said, how long? The keeper said 2 days, perhaps less. Riggs sat down on the cold metal floor because his legs had stopped working. Little climbed down from his shoulder and pressed against his side. Soot came back from the keeper and lay across his lap, heavy and warm, and Riggs put one hand on Soot's back and felt the steady young heart beating under the scales. He looked up at the keeper. He said, can you fight? The keeper closed its pale eyes for a long moment. When it opened them again it said, I am dying. I have been dying for 100 years. I have enough left in me for one last thing, and one last thing only. Riggs said, what? The keeper said, I can teach them what their wings are for. Outside the great dome, the dust belt turned slowly around them, and somewhere in it 3 gray ships were already moving, and Riggs understood that he was not going home tomorrow and maybe not ever. He nodded once. He said, then teach them. The keeper began. 2 days was not enough time to learn how to fly. The keeper knew it. Riggs knew it. The 4 young dragons did not know it because they were young. Soot learned the fastest. On the first morning the keeper coaxed him onto a low ledge and pushed him gently with the flat of its great nose, and Soot fell badly and slid across the floor with his wings tangled, and Penny laughed at him in chirps. Soot tried again. By the afternoon he could glide the length of the docking bay. By the evening he could catch a small thermal off the dying reactor vents and ride it for half a minute before he had to land. Penny learned by watching. She waited until Soot had done it badly enough times that she could see the mistake, and then she stepped off the ledge already half flying. Bram took the longest. He had to be coaxed by the keeper for hours, but once he understood what wings were for he flew with a slow, steady patience that surprised everyone. Little did not fly on the first day. Little watched. Riggs and Hetty did not waste the time. While the dragons learned their wings, Riggs went out to the Marabelle and stripped every salvage charge from his cargo hold. He had been carrying them for years, the small magnetic kind used to break apart old hulls, and he had 19 of them, and he set them out one by one along the inside of the great docking bay in a careful ring. Hetty worked on the cradle ship's old comm array with parts from the Marabelle's galley, splicing wires that had not carried a signal since before either of them was born. The keeper grew weaker as the hours passed. By the second morning it could no longer lift its head from the platform. It lay with its great eyes half closed, breathing slow, and it taught the dragons with its voice alone. Little finally flew at midday on the second day. It was a short flight. Little lifted off the ledge with both small wings spread, and the torn ear caught the air wrong, and Little wobbled badly. But Little did not fall. Little flew a slow, ragged circle around the dome and landed on the keeper's great folded paw, and the keeper opened its eyes and made a small sound that might have been laughter in its own language. The scavenger ships arrived an hour later, 3 of them, lean, sharp, painted dark. They came out of the dust in a slow line, the way wolves came out of trees, and they did not hail the cradle ship because they did not need to. They had done this many times before. Hetty's signal went out at the same moment. She had spent 2 days splicing the old comm array, and when she pressed the final switch the cradle ship's antennas, which had not broadcast in 4 centuries, came alive across every Voran frequency the keeper still remembered. The hum went out into the dust belt. It went out loud and steady, and it carried the shape of the 4 young dragons in it, the way a mother bird carried the smell of her chicks. 3 things happened then, very fast. The first was that the scavengers reached the outer ring of Riggs's salvage charges. Riggs triggered them all at once. The charges were not weapons. They were not meant to kill. But 19 of them going off in a tight ring threw out a wall of debris and magnetic shock that fried the lead scavenger's sensors and forced all 3 ships to slow. The second was that the cradle ship's old defense grid, dark for 4 centuries, woke up. It did not wake fully. Most of its weapons were dead, but 2 of its old slow turrets near the docking bay began to track. They fired once. They fired badly. But they fired, and the scavengers had not expected anything on this ship to fire at all. The third was that the hum on Hetty's broadcast reached 3 other cradle ships in the dust belt that nobody had thought were alive. Their lights came on. Old keepers, thought dead, lifted their heads in the dark for the first time in lifetimes. Their voices answered the broadcast in a slow, rising chorus. Their old defense grids, dim but not all gone, began to wake. The scavengers ran. They turned, all 3 of them, and ran back into the dust the way they had come, and they did not stop running. The keeper did not survive the day. It died slowly, with its great head resting against Little's small flank, and Little stayed beside it and did not move. The keeper smiled the thin, strange smile of its kind, and it said one last word in its own language, and then it closed its pale eyes for the last time. Riggs sat on the deck of the Marabelle a long time after. He had 4 young dragons asleep around him, heavy and warm. Hetty sat beside him with her hand on his arm, and she was crying quietly, and so was he. The comm stayed open. Across the dust belt, other voices answered. Old keepers wept into dim consoles. Old cradle ships began to drift slowly toward each other, finding each other for the first time in 4 centuries. A dead species was opening its eyes again. Little climbed into Riggs's lap and pressed the torn ear against his chest. Riggs put his hand on the small, warm back, and he did not feel like a hero. He felt like a tired man who had picked up a crying box in the dark and brought it home. But across the dust, hope was burning again. And it was small, and it was scaled, and it was sleeping against his ribs.